at Mare Island. It was stuffed with all the latest American inventions here. The commander lived here for 2 or 3 months prior to the expedition. So this is where it all began. It's very much a San Francisco story. This is the home of, really, a figurative and literal home of the Jeanette. Yeah, it is true, though. These expeditions tend to go south. They go north, everything goes south. But great to be back. So, yeah, I'm going to talk tonight about the Jeanette. Not only the Jeanette itself, but the travels that I went through to pursue this story, because it took me kind of all over the world. By far the most traveling that I've ever done with any of my stories. All over Europe, Germany, France, all over the United States, but mostly Russia, Siberia, the Bering Strait, and it's one of those stories that sprawls all over the world, really. And so I found out about this story originally. I was on an assignment for National Geographic. I write for National Geographic a lot. I have the current cover story in National Geographic right now, which is about weed. It's about marijuana. But but I digress. The assignment that I was on, National Geographic sent me to Oslo to write about this amazing polar explorer named Fridtjof Nansen. Nansen had tried in the 1890s to duplicate the voyage of the USS Jeanette, and in a slightly differently designed vessel with all sorts of tweaks. This is one of the things you figure out about these Arctic explorers is that most people would say, oh, that one didn't go well, maybe we shouldn't go up there. What they do is they go, no, I'm going to change it just slightly. I'm going to different vessel, different food, more lime juice, something slightly different from the previous one, and we're gonna make it to the North Pole. Nansen, at his museum in Oslo, an amazing museum called the Fram Museum, dedicated to his vessel, his boat, the Fram. All over that museum, you see references to the Jeanette, the Jeanette, the Jeanette. Everyone knows about the Jeanette, apparently, over there. But how many of you, barring those who've actually read the book, had ever heard of the voyage of the USS Jeanette? One, two,
No,
maybe?
I've never heard of it.
Oh, okay. Maybe a half over there, it seemed like 0.5. So that's exactly the point. And this is where the voyage was launched. So that's the point. That's why I wrote the book, really. When I asked the dumb question, and I think that's how a lot of great nonfiction books begin. You ask the dumb question. Well, what was the Jeanette? I'm an American. I should know this. I work for Outside Magazine. I write for National Geographic. I kind of am steeped in some of these kinds of stories, and I've never heard of it. So it launched me on this 3-year odyssey to try to understand what the voyage was, what it was all about. These men, though, in their time, the survivors of the Jeanette were hailed as heroes, as they were celebrated all over the world. They were the subject of many newspaper and magazine articles and books, and given all sorts of medals by Congress and by the president. Subject of blockbuster newspaper stories, especially in the New York Herald. Parades in Manhattan, monuments all over America, and best-selling books. The journals and the log books of the expedition were published as best-selling 2-volume best-selling book. Now, one place where the voyage is fairly well known is this place. This is Annapolis Naval Academy. The Navy claims this as one of their expeditions, and certainly DeLong is well known there. He was a graduate. DeLong is the captain of the Jeanette. Was celebrated there in the Naval Academy, and when I went to the Navy Academy to give a talk, some of the midshipmen came up to me and said, it's a ritual here at the Naval Academy. We have to count at midnight. We have to go and count the number of icicles on the Jeannette Memorial and report back to duty. I guess it's your tax dollars at work. Okay, so the Jeannette expedition, though, was based really on an old idea, trying to prove or disprove the existence of something that was completely and entirely mythical. This idea of the open polar sea, an idea that goes back for hundreds of years, back to the Vikings, back to the Greeks, and it's a fanciful idea. This notion that there is at the top of the world some sort of warm place where it's perpetually warm, and where somewhere beyond the ice there exists this kind of utopia. It has its existence, it goes way back, but it really became solidified with this map, a 1592 Mercator map, which shows very clearly an open polar sea. Let's see if this works, yeah. So there were reportedly 4 different portals or ways in through the ice to the open polar sea, and in the middle was supposed to be an iron mountain, which explains why compasses work. Obviously wrong, obviously fanciful, but once you get an idea like this engraved in a map, a beautiful map, a widely circulated map, it becomes increasingly difficult to dislodge that idea from the public imagination. And so for hundreds of years, you had this succession of scientists and pseudoscientists and explorers who tried to prove it or disprove it. And so this kind of shows the general idea a little bit more focused. The Vikings had talked about something called Ultima Thule, some place beyond the beyond that was perhaps tropical, where there was tropical animals and where it was summer year-round. And the Greeks, of course, had Hyperborea. They talked about beyond the ice somewhere there was a mountain range where it was summer perpetually and where the griffins lived, part eagle, part lion. In the 1800s, especially here in America, you began to get a succession of these cranks, these lecturers, and various people who had these ideas of precisely what's up there. And John Cleve Sims, he was from Cincinnati, who filled lecture halls everywhere he went, talked about something he called holes at the poles. He believed that there was a hollow earth, and that at the north and south poles there were these giant holes that led down into the earth, and these people there was a whole civilization down there, and they were dying for us to go find them. And Congress believed this and sent an expedition actually Congress tangentially to prove this. So it's in the early going of the book, I have a little bit of fun trying to explore the different theories about what was up there and what was down there. And it's a very interesting period in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Sims, though, he believed that there were these massive holes. This is from Harper's Magazine, Sims's hole, and it was as it would appear to a lunarian with a telescope. So you're out on the moon looking at the Earth. Okay, so that's you get the idea. So I thought this was a very antiquarian idea, but then I Googled holes at the poles and came up with this and a lot of other stuff. It turns out there's a very vibrant subculture of people who still believe in the holes at the poles theory, and they believe that NASA, and this is supposedly a NASA photograph, by the way, that's been suppressed. The Obama administration particularly has been trying to prevent us from knowing what's up there. These people want us to find them, but the government is just in the way. So it's a persistent idea, a deeply embedded idea that there's something up there, something powerful and magnificent and grandiose. And I think it goes, it's deeply embedded apparently in our DNA. Jules Verne, of course, published the popular book in the Journey to the Center of the Earth. in the mid 1800s. This kind of further solidified the notion of an open polar sea. Although he put it underground, he thought it was a subterranean ocean. He called it the Central Sea. But this kind of goes to show you just how popular this notion was. Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, she had the monster going all the way to the North Pole, and the doctor following his monster all the way to the top of the world. There was just this profound, sort of nagging, gnawing obsession with what was at the top of the world. It drove people crazy not to know. There was only a few places left where man had never been. Big sections of the earth, parts of the interior of Africa, parts of the interior of Australia, and the Arctic and the Antarctic. There's Frankenstein looking good there at the North Pole. Now, okay, so moving beyond scientific theory into and literary theory into fact. Santa Claus lives at the North Pole. We know this to be true, and I thought it was a really old idea. It must go back many, many hundreds of years, but in fact, it has its origins in a cartoon, a NAST cartoon from the 1860s. Really, the kind of formative period of my story, where in Harper's. Shows very clearly Santa and his helpers, and this whole idea of that's where the action happens, up there at the North Pole. So again, I think it speaks to a public fascination with the North Pole and a need to believe that there was something warm and fuzzy and jolly and wonderful up there. If we could just get beyond the ice, that's the problem. There's always this problem of the ice at about the 80th parallel. It's always there. It doesn't seem to go away. There was also scientists and various thinkers who devoted a lot of psychic energy to this problem, and this is maybe the foremost of those. Dr. August Petermann from Germany, who was at that point the preeminent maker of maps in the world, Google Maps of that period. They were beautiful, hand-colored, but very detailed maps. Explorers would venture out into the world and they'd come back with their field notes and they would report directly to Dr. Petermann in his publishing empire there in Gotha, Germany, in the middle of in the middle of Europe. And he would take notes, and then he would produce these beautiful updated maps. So Petermann is an important character in the early phases of the book. He's really interesting. He's can hold forth on every scientific topic. He's very eloquent. He's erudite. He also has excellent facial hair. He, as so many of the characters in this book do, the Gilded Age is just full of all of these amazing beards and mustaches. So that's Petermann. I wanted to understand his world, his atlases, the power that maps had at that point. Anyone who had the ability to create beautiful and detailed and accurate maps was a powerful person. And so that gave him a platform to expound upon all of his very bizarre ideas about the Arctic. He was wrong just about on every count when it came to the Arctic. He was right on a lot of other things, but the Arctic seemed to be, he was always wrong. I went to Germany, to Gotha, to understand his world, his publishing universe, and monuments that were devoted to this man. He was an amazing character and very, very influential throughout the mid-1800s. Now this begins to show a little bit of his idea of the open polar sea. We were beginning at that point to understand the power of the Gulf Stream, this amazing current that goes from the tropics all the way past England, past Norway, and headed north in some direction. Men, the very thinkers at the time didn't precisely know where it went, but the thinking was that it tunneled, it met the ice, tunneled under the ice, and kept going north with this intense power. It was all this thermal power, and the idea was, well, perhaps the Earth has this regulative system, just like a human being does, or any other animal. So he was interested in the Gulf Stream, but also on the Pacific side there was this amazing current called the Kuroshima, which swept up past Japan. It's a very important and very powerful current as well. They didn't know where it went. The thinking was that it went through the Bering Strait, and that these two currents, in a completely symmetrical and organized way, only a German thinker could come up with this kind of systematic way of thinking about the planet, and that these two currents met at the North Pole, thus creating the open polar sea. Finally, we have proof of the open polar sea, at least theoretical proof. Unfortunately, what happens is men have to go up there to prove it or disprove it, and usually die or suffer greatly in order to do so. One of the guys who was really intrigued by Peterman's ideas was this guy, the third richest man in Manhattan, the publisher and editor of the largest newspaper in the world, the New York Herald. This is James Gordon Bennett Jr., who is this amazing, spoiled brat, Gilded Age, outsized character. You can't invent a guy like this. I mean, he's just unbelievable. He's a reckless and fearless adventurer in his youth. He won the first transatlantic yacht race. He became the youngest commodore of the New York Yacht Club. He introduced various sports to the United States. He was famous for coach racing around Manhattan at midnight, nude. What else can I say about him? He publicly urinated into a grand piano at a party at his fiance's house, and was banished, blackballed from the United States, essentially, after fighting a duel, and ended up in Paris, where he created the Paris Herald, which became the International Herald Tribune, which still exists as part of his empire. He ran the New York Herald by transatlantic cable from Paris. And he was just absolutely intrigued by the Arctic, by spectacle of all sorts, and sent his reporters all over the world in pursuit of these kinds of stories. This is his newspaper. He had all kinds of fetishes. He had all kinds of weird quirks. He was really into Pomeranians. He had over 100 of them. He was really interested in owls. Owls was the symbol of his newspaper. You can see the owls on the parapets there. And these owls at the headquarters in New York had red lights in their eyes, and they would wink at you, at nighttime. Curious character. People have said he is the model for Bruce Wayne. This strange, curious bachelor, aloof, very wealthy, and someone who had a kind of fetish for night creatures, flying night creatures. One of his many yachts, the Lysistrata. So my wife and I, felt like, at least I did, I felt like I had to go to Paris to research Bennett. And we did. And this was one of his many mansions and that he lived in Paris, a villa that he had in the south of France. That's the view from his mansion. We kind of blundered our way into the house, and they knew all about Bennett, of course, and there was all sorts of remnants of Bennett, including owls everywhere. And in the back there was over 100 graves for his Pomeranians. He's also famous for introducing international ballooning to, or this concept of an international balloon race, the Gordon Bennett Cup, which exists to this day. It's the premier balloon race in the world. So a very interesting cat, and a wonderful character. He threatened to kind of overtake the entire book because he was just like, wow, you can't make this up. However, he's most famous for sending this guy, Henry Morton Stanley, to Africa to find Livingstone, I presume. Livingston wasn't really lost. Livingston didn't exactly need to be found, but it made for a great series of dispatches, blockbuster newspaper articles in the New York Herald. So in a lot of ways, what Bennett was looking for was an encore to Livingston Stanley when he kind of hatched this idea of bankrolling an expedition to the North Pole. And he was a real big believer that newspapers shouldn't just report the news, that they should make news, they should create news, and news that would keep creating and sort of building on itself. So he sent his reporters on all kinds of expeditions, but was particularly interested in the North Pole. And in August Peterman's ideas about the open polar sea. So he hired this guy, the protagonist of the story, the captain of the USS Jeannette, George Washington DeLong, graduate of the Naval Academy, someone who had been to Greenland and had decided to devote the rest of his life to this great planetary enigma of, what's up there? Let's figure it out, and let's do it in the name of science, in the name of the U.S. Navy, and in the name of the United States. It was a really interesting time coming out of the Civil War and the devastation of that conflict. The United States was beginning to kind of flex its muscles on the world stage, trying to compete with the Brits and some of the other European powers. And this was a way, kind of a quasi-military way of competing for this great grail. We had also recently purchased Alaska from the Russians, so there was great curiosity about what was up there, what was north of our new acquisition, and so the time was ripe to begin to explore that stretch of the world. No one had ever been north of Alaska. Some Arctic whalers had kind of skirted along the edges, but this was terra incognita. This is no man's land. So there was a great upwelling of support for this expedition. So Bennett and DeLong purchased this boat, the Pandora, from the British and renamed it the Jeannette after Gordon Bennett's sister, Jeannette. This is a photograph taken in Le Havre, France. DeLong and his wife Emma and a small crew sailed it in 1878 from France all the way across the Horn, around the Horn to San Francisco, where it was practically rebuilt at Bear Island and reinforced massively for the ice that they knew they would encounter. And DeLong began to stuff the ship with all the latest American inventions and all the equipment he thought he would need for this journey, including Thomas Edison's lights, which had just been invented. They were still they had a few bugs. They weren't quite ready for prime time, and in fact they didn't work. But he wanted to light up the polar night. It's dark for essentially 6 months of the year. And DeLong thought this would be a great thing. So also telephone equipment from Alexander Graham Bell, all sorts of telegraph equipment. They wanted to be able to communicate over a vast expanse of the ice. Many kegs of Budweiser beer, an organ, a state-of-the-art library. This was the Gilded Age. They didn't want to suffer too much. So they stuffed the ship with all the latest, the fruits of invention, and left from San Francisco in the summer of 1879, off to the pole. 20,000 people gathered by the bay to wish them well as they headed north towards Alaska. Alaska was the last stop. They acquired 40 dogs and 2 Inuit hunters and lots of supplies there, and then they headed off into the unknown. North of the Bering Strait, into the Chukchi Sea, hoping to find this warm water current and ultimately sail to the North Pole. They didn't find the warm water current. They didn't find the open polar sea. What they found was ice. Lots and lots of ice. They got trapped in the ice in September of '79, and they began to drift, more or less in a northwesterly fashion, for 2 years. 2 years in the ice, stuck there. The ice constantly warring with itself, the ice warring with the ship. Lots of churning and shrieking and sighing and screaming. The journals of DeLong describe it beautifully as they constantly fighting this battle with the ice. 2 years in the ice, it kind of presented an interesting dilemma for me as a writer, as a narrative writer. I wanted to make it interesting. It's sort of like Groundhog Day. Every day is more or less the same. So I did this thing I never thought I would do. I just sort of had a space break and cut to the next section of the book, and I said, 1 year later, because nothing had changed for that year. They weren't exactly suffering. They had enough food for 3 years. They didn't have any particular diseases. They were just going slowly mad from boredom and from too much togetherness as they churned slowly through the ice. But I got to know these men. I got to love them and hate them, and I felt like I was living in that 2 year period. And some of the characters, some of the really interesting characters began to emerge during that period. Among those characters was Melville, George Melville, really the other great hero of the story, an engineer, a man who could fix anything and everything. And believe me, everything went wrong in this expedition, and he was called upon to, usually he was the guy to fix the problem, whatever it was. When it began to leak, the ship began to leak profoundly and was almost sank. He devised a whole system of windmills to bring up water from the hull, things like that. He was constantly the one to fix the problem, whatever it was, and he emerges as really the hero of the story. This is Melville late in life, when he was Rear Admiral of the U.S. Navy. He had been named the chief engineer of the whole U.S. Navy, widely revered figure in Navy circles. Okay, there's Collins, another interesting character, an Irishman, Collins, who was brilliant. He was the meteorologist. He was also a writer. He was supposed to write the book for Bennett. He was a correspondent for the New York Herald. Unfortunately, though, Collins had a propensity for delivering really, really bad puns. He had a sense of wordplay about him, which is wonderful. We've all been around people like that. For a day or two, it's fine. 2 years. Everyone wanted to wring his neck by the time this expedition is into its second year. There's the surgeon, Ambler from Virginia, who saw every kind of ailment, every kind of vitamin deficiency, polar bear, overingestion of polar bear liver, lead poisoning, and he had to improvise and be extremely creative as he went about this expedition. One of the patients that he had to treat was this guy, the navigator of the Jeanette, Dannenhauer, amazing guy, also a graduate of the Naval Academy, but it turned out he had syphilis. And he had acquired it obviously earlier in life, but it began to manifest itself in the form of this condition called syphilitic iritis, which is a problem in the eye that requires he had to undergo multiple dozens of operations without anesthesia down in the ship. And so during that 2 year period, that's a part of the story. He couldn't tolerate light of any kind, so he had to wear these goggles for the entire expedition. And so it kind of epitomizes the voyage of the Jeanette. That is, what you had essentially was a blind navigator. Not a good thing. Okay, so this shows the general drift of the Jeanette. The first year was this thing right here, this kind of amorphous, very tangled kind of, one step forward, 2 steps back thing. And it was just incredibly agonizing and frustrating for DeLong that first year they kept circling back on themselves, just hopeless and helpless in the ice. But by the second year, they began to straighten out and move, generally speaking, in the right direction. DeLong, by this point, had given up on the open polar sea. He decided that they wouldn't sail to the North Pole, but they might drift there, following the prevailing currents of the ice pack. And so, as long as the ship could hold out, and thank God they had completely rebuilt it here in San Francisco, he thought, well, maybe there's a chance we can make it, or at least get close enough to get our dogs out on the ice, make a dash to the North Pole. So that was his new thinking as the expedition evolved. Another thing that DeLong had his men do during this 2-year period was go out on the ice every day and take lots and lots and lots and lots of measurements, and enter them into these log books. And these are huge log books. They're ledger of folio-sized books. And when I was reading them at the National Archives in Washington, I kept thinking, wow, this is amazing. The amount of detail, barometric pressure, temperature of the water, wind velocity, thickness of the ice, all this kind of detail. I thought it's amazing, and the amount of discipline that was required to get all this measurement is extraordinary, but what a waste, what a waste that no one is ever going to use this. But then I found out that there's a group that's sponsored by some NOAA scientists called Old Weather. Old Weather is an extraordinary group of sort of citizen scientists who have been taking all these old ledgers and logbooks from the heroic age of exploration and digitizing the information so that scientists can begin to understand just how far and how fast the ice has changed and deteriorated over the century. Because one of the big problems, of course, with talking about global warming is we can say what the ice looks like now, but we really don't know what the ice looked like 150 years ago. To do that, you'd have to get in a time machine, go back in time, ram yourself in the ice, drift in the ice for 2 years, and take daily measurements of all sorts of things. No one would ever do that. Well, they did, and it's the Jeannette, particularly in this stretch of the Arctic. No one had ever been there before. No one had ever explored this vast swath of the Arctic. So it was particularly heartening to me to find out that this existed, and that these scientists were now studying the Jeannette logs and learning all this about the condition of the ice then, so they could compare it to the way it is now. So when I'm writing these books, these narrative histories, I really like to, whenever possible, of course, travel to the places that I'm writing about, to understand the topography and just the whole atmosphere of these places. Gives you a lot of confidence when you're writing those passages to have been there. I decided that I needed to go to mainly Russia. That's where most of the story takes place. So I decided to, first of all, get a really bad haircut. And don't know what happened there. These things happen. Go to Moscow. I hoped I could just go via Alaska and go up through the Bering Strait that way. But I needed a lot of permits because I was going into some restricted areas that, the Russians just love permits. Lots and lots of permits. And this was back when our relationship was a little bit better than it is now. I went to Moscow. I got the permits that I needed. Flew 8 or 9 time zones east, all the way to the east coast of Siberia, to this place, Anadyr, where I picked up a Russian icebreaker that was heading north to Wrangel Island, with a crew of woolly mammoth experts and a lot of really serious birders, Arctic bird watchers. And we started heading north. And I thought it was completely ridiculous that I had to travel 13,000 miles around the world to look at my own country, to look at Alaska. So we were heading north, waving at Sarah Palin the whole way, of course, and we made several stops along the uninhabited shores of Siberia, working our way north. So the sound this is one of the sound ones. We'll see how it works. So we eventually did make a stop at one of the villages along the way, a place called Uelen, where they had just killed a whale and were having sort of a summer festival, and they invited us ashore, and we had a great time as they were doing their dances and wrestling matches and all kinds of things. So I think there's a clip here. Let's see how this works. iPhone, one of the great inventions, the iPhone. The soldiers there didn't really want us to be there. They had Kalashnikovs and they wanted us to leave quickly. So we did, and got back aboard the ship and kept going north towards Wrangell Island, where we began to encounter more and more ice. This particular summer, there was a record amount of ice in that particular part of the Arctic, and we became very, very glad that we were on board an icebreaker, because it got thicker and thicker as we went. This is August. This is August, by the way. And then I took this shot from the bow of the ship, looking straight down as we kind of blasted through the ice. So that one brought us to a complete halt, and we had to back up and find our way through the ice. I had this idea that the ice was, once you're stuck in the ice, as DeLong was, that you're kind of stuck in this slab. That it's kind of, that's it, you're stuck in the ice. But it's not like that at all. It's constantly moving and churning and making these horrible shrieking sounds, and it's a fascinating, very kind of living environment, and I wasn't really aware of that. I kind of had to go on this trip to figure that out. But we did eventually reach our destination, Wrangell Island, which is an extraordinary place. It's been called the Galapagos of the High North because of all the wildlife that lives there. Huge populations of Pacific walrus and Arctic fox and snow geese and snowy owls and polar bear. We came ashore on board these little Zodiac rafts. We were met by some Russian rangers who live there year-round. It's otherwise an uninhabited island. I was doing a story for National Geographic about Wrangell Island, and was working with a photographer, a Russian photographer named Sergei Gorshkov, who's been going to Wrangell for over a decade, taking lots of great images. But we got ashore, and I'm telling you, these Russian rangers were so happy to see us. Fresh human beings. We were glad that the few dwellings that they had there were protected by these homemade bear guards, because the polar bear are everywhere on Wrangell. They congregate in large numbers because the ice has been so consistently unreliable for the last decade or so. There's nowhere to go for thousands of miles in any direction, so many of them end up here on Wrangel Island. These are Sergei's photographs that they ran in National Geographic. The geese and the fox are constantly fighting over the eggs. Muskox. It's a huge island. It's about 90 miles long. It was originally discovered or landed upon and claimed by the United States, not by DeLong. Now, DeLong and his men of the Jeannette had tried to land on Wrangel as they went past it, but the ice quickly moved them up and over and around it so quickly that they could not make a landing. But in the summer of 1881, the United States sent a vessel north to look for signs of the Jeannette because they'd been missing for 2 years. And so they sent this vessel from San Francisco, the cutter Corwin, to head north to look for any tidings of the Jeannette. And I should explain also that that Wrangel Island is also believed to be the last place on Earth where woolly mammoths lived. Some 3,000 years after they became extinct on the mainland, they were still living on Wrangel. So you see these mastodon tusks all over the place in riverbeds, and I tried to fit this into my overnight bag, but it didn't work out. Amazing place, Wrangel Island. But the Corwin, back to the Corwin went north looking for the Jeannette and was able to make landfall on the island. They raised an American flag and claimed it as U.S. territory. And on board that ship was the father of the American environmental movement, the great conservationist John Muir, who then was a young newspaper reporter here in San Francisco, and he just wanted to go along for the ride, and wrote beautifully about it in a series of newspaper articles that were published posthumously in a great book called The Cruise of the Corwin. So he becomes an important character in the middle sections of the book. Also excellent facial hair. Okay, so from Wrangel Island and my travels there, I then moved on into the sort of central part of the Russian coast to this place, the largest river delta in the world. This is the Lena Delta, a massive river that flows into the Arctic and is an important part of the story. It is the size of 3 Florida Everglades, but frozen Everglades, and hundreds and thousands of islands and oxbow lakes and all these different streams. It's an amazing place. I wanted to go there because I heard that there was a place called America Mountain, 400 miles north of the Arctic Circle. In this delta, there's a place called America Mountain, which is a monument to the Jeannette. And I'd heard about it. I wanted to know if it was still there. So for Outside Magazine, I went and took forever. It took a lot of bribing and a lot of whiskey, a lot of vodka especially, a lot of cigarettes to get myself and convince various riverboat captains to get me to this place. Worked our way into the delta. Finally found America Mountain, had to get on board a sort of smaller boat and then finally a raft, and then we started wading across some mosquito-infested swamp. The mosquitoes are just incredible in Siberia, and found America Mountain and found the memorial, more or less the way it was left in the 1880s, the Jeannette Monument. So a lot of travels, a lot of this was the joy and the fun of doing this book was reaching these places. Okay, so back to the historical story. The Jeannette, all through 1880 and 1881, was drifting slowly but surely towards the northwest. But DeLong began to realize that the pressure of the ice was going to crush the ship. There's nothing he could really do about it. Finally, in June of that year, 1881, it began to sink. So he got, as quickly as he could, he had about 30 minutes, he got his belongings and his men and his 40 dogs out on the ice, and tried to organize it as best he could. Let's see. And his 3 small whaleboats that they knew they were going to have to drag behind them. And then finally the ship sank. This is a French painting which shows the sinking of the Jeannette. I don't think it was quite as heroic as this, but it was devastating nonetheless to watch your home go to the bottom of the Arctic Ocean, and that you're stranded out there on the ice, 1,000 miles from the nearest landmass, which is the central Arctic coast of Siberia, the Lena Delta. Okay, so we know exactly where the Jeannette sank. DeLong took very good measurements of that positional readings of where it sank, and there's been a movement in the last year since the book came out among some Russian scientists and some American scientists, also the U.S. Navy, NOAA, and a couple of wealthy benefactors. Although we need a really wealthy, we need a James Gordon Bennett right now, maybe a Paul Allen or a James Cameron or something. Although he's apparently a real jerk. To help us, because we want to find it. We want to go. We want to find it. We want to photograph it, bring up some relics, and it's in Russian waters. It's right in the middle, kind of in the middle of a place called the DeLong Islands, which named after George DeLong. So that's something that's being talked about more and more, is mounting an expedition to locate the wreck. But during the summer of 1881, while the men were struggling out on that ice pack, Bennett, meanwhile, had decided that it was time to introduce this newfangled sport popular in England called tennis to the United States. So we built this palace called the Newport Casino in Newport, Rhode Island, devoted to tennis. And that summer, he introduced the sport in the first competitive match in the United States. So it's kind of cutting back and forth between what the men are undergoing and what's happening back in America. Bennett invites George DeLong's wife, Emma DeLong, to Newport that summer to check out the tennis and the yachting scene there, and Emma DeLong becomes a really important character in the book for all kinds of reasons. She's an amazing writer. She writes beautiful letters, and she becomes an important character also because I had this kind of amazing experience that happened. I think all historians fantasize that, for their books, they'll be able to find a distant relative of the protagonist, and that relative will say, well, it's funny that you call because I've got a trunk in my attic full of letters, yellowed old letters that are just waiting for someone to read. Would you please take them off my hands? And that actually happened in this case. It's never happened to me before, probably never happened again, but I cold called a woman in Connecticut named Catherine DeLong, and she said, I'm the right DeLong, and in fact I have this trunk full of letters, and I really don't know what to do with it. So I flew immediately to Connecticut and sat with her, and we went over this stuff. She let me take it home, and it's all going to end up in the Naval Academy Museum eventually. But here's Catherine DeLong at the Explorers Club in New York, which is also an amazing place. I did a talk there, and lots of taxidermy. This polar bear was shot by Peary, supposedly, and there's a switch somewhere on the wall. You flip the switch and it goes roar. Pretty cheesy, but pretty great. Anyway, that's Catherine DeLong. So in this trove of belongings, lots of photographs, their courtship letters between George and Emma, all kinds of great stuff. But the best stuff were these letters that Emma wrote in the summer of 1880 and 1881 she called them her letters to nowhere, and they're essentially love letters to her husband that she sent north. She copied them in triplicate and sent them north by way of these Arctic whalers in the hope that they would reach her husband somehow. And they're beautiful, and they start out very calm and very deliberate, and then they become a little more urgent and more haunting and more beautiful as the story progresses. And so I really use them a lot in the book, and she becomes a major character and kind of the emotional spine of the story. It really becomes kind of a love story. So one of the great letters, one of her letters to nowhere, was this one that she sent by way of Greenland. And they ended up somehow in this hut in far, far northern Greenland. And in the early 1900s, many years later, Peary is on his way to the North Pole, and he finds this letter in a hut, and still has the red wax seal on the letter. And he found the letter, and he knew, of course, who wrote it. He stuck it into his furs and eventually returned it to Emma DeLong in New York City, unopened. So that's one of the letters in the trove that I got from Catherine DeLong. So the men during this period are struggling over the ice. They have just that summer to do what they need to do, which is to drag their boats and their few belongings across the ice, reach open water, and try to sail to Siberia. Siberia is not really known as a hopeful place anyway. This is their only hope, is to somehow reach Siberia and reach safety and reach civilization that way. DeLong, this part of the story is, it's a story of camaraderie and leadership and men striving, trying to save themselves. And it's as hard as it was, it's also the most hopeful period for the men. They're somehow inexplicably happy during this period. They're organized into teams. They know what they're trying to do. Although they don't have any food, they go out in teams and hunt for food and are never wanting. They are successful in finding polar bear and walrus and seal. My editor wants me to do a companion volume. It would be called the Jeanette Cookbook. They're eating, fermented, walrus fetus, all kinds of weird stuff. The diet is terrible, but they're not starving, and they don't develop scurvy. The perfect trifecta of all these Arctic voyages is scurvy, cannibalism, and mutiny. None of which happened on this expedition. It's extremely well led and well run and well organized, and all of that is a credit to DeLong and Melville and the other officers as they work their way south. This shows the general drift of their, the progression of their retreat across the ice. Now, for a little while they're going north, and it's not because they don't have a compass. It's because there's a 2-week period where they're making huge progress, they think, and when they finally are able to take a positional reading, only to learn that the ice over which they're moving is drifted to the north faster than they're moving south. A low point, no question, the low point in the expedition. DeLong is so demoralized by this. But his motto, his expression that he is always reiterating, nil desperandum, never despair. Nil desperandum is sort of the motto of this whole retreat across the ice, and a chant that the men keep saying over and over again. They finally do kind of straighten out, and they work their way south. They discover an island called Bennett Island, claim it for the United States, and raise the American flag over it. It's now Russian territory, but they work their way through the New Siberian Islands, which is an archipelago, working their way toward the Lena Delta. Finally, they reach open water. They put their whaleboats into the water, only to find that they can't float. Dragging them over the ice, they nearly ruin these boats. And so Melville and his carpenters get to work. and they rebuild the boats with using whalebone and walrus tusks and driftwood and whatever they can find to patch them up. And they got them seaworthy, and they finally, in late August, set sail for Siberia. And that is where I leave the story. The last 150 pages of the book I don't talk about because I think it's much more powerful and much more haunting and much more beautiful if you don't know the fate of these three boats. It's really the story of the very different fates of these three whaleboats as they work their way south towards Siberia. I was at Google headquarters at lunch today, and what I told them was, don't Google it. You can Google it and find out what happened, but don't. You can also read the New York Times book review, which was a complete plot summary of the entire book. Don't do that either. I think you'll find that the story of these three boats and how they held their mission together, and the camaraderie, the loyalty, and the incredible discipline of these men is going to be a very inspiring story, and it certainly was for me. One of the great survival stories, I think, one of the great adventure stories of all time. The American Shackleton is what I call it. It's 35 years before Shackleton. It's the North, not the South Pole. It's American, not British, but it is truly one of the great stories of human striving that I've ever encountered, and kept me busy for 3 years, traveling all over the world, pulling this tale together. So that's the story of the Jeanette. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. Any of you have any questions about the book, how I wrote it, anything at all? Yes, sir.
Just curious, where the Jeanette sank, how deep?
It's 175 feet, maybe 200 feet. So this is really important because it needs to be deep enough to be unscathed by the underside of the ice, because that often happens. The ice will just sweep over the wrecks and just destroy the wreck. What we know about Arctic wrecks that are in extremely cold water like that is that they tend to be preserved really, really well. And as long as the ice didn't destroy it, and it's kind of on that cusp, could go either way, I think the condition of the wreck should be really, really good. And what's in there, I don't know. Budweiser beer, Edison's lights, all the photographs that were taken on these glass plates. Not clear whether they could be preserved in any way, shape, or form, but they were supposedly packaged well, and there's a chance that those could be found and preserved. So, yeah, thanks for your question. Any other questions in the very back there?
Yeah, did he manage to get all of his records out? You made allusion to some of the records, the meteorological records and so forth.
Yeah.
Were there other things, and did he get them out?
Yeah, I mean, really the story of the Jeanette is ultimately the story of these logbooks and journals and diaries that were lugged. They went through the ice for over 1,000 miles, and then they were preserved out on the ice, dragged across the ice pack, across the ocean, across the tundra to Yakutsk, and finally Irkutsk, and then taken by train all the way to St. Petersburg, and by steam ship all the way to New York, and finally ended up in the National Archives. All of them. And all this data, like I said, is being kind of poured over by scientists now, and it's proving really valuable. Yeah, how you doing?
How did the American islands become Russian?
Good question. And then there's websites, very, very active, vibrant websites on this one as well. We didn't press our claim. We raised a flag over Wrangel Island, over Bennett Island. Also, there's an island called Henrietta, and another one called the Jeanette Island. But we didn't press our claim, and Russia did colonized, and in some cases, some of those islands colonized them. So, but there's a lot of controversy about this, and claims that Obama gave the islands away to Putin. It's not quite that simple, diplomacy and lots of treaties and all kinds of stuff. But there's a lot of interest in the Arctic now, intensified interest because of petrochemicals, because the ice is melting, so that the northwest and northeast passages are reliable in the summertime. So there's a lot of interest, and you'll see a lot more controversy about it, particularly Wrangel Island, which is the only one that is very valuable in my opinion. It's an extraordinary piece of real estate, and we should have pressed our claim there. I think it's sort of an extension of Alaska in some way. This is not the southern Wrangel. There's another island called Wrangel, kind of in the southern part of Alaska. This is way to the northeast of Siberia, way above the Arctic Circle, way above the Bering Strait. That Wrangel Island. But thanks for your question.
I was going to say, I sent you an email because I did, back in the 60s, I did four field seasons in the mountains, the long mountains in Alaska.
Oh yeah.
And we never really, we never knew who DeLong really was until I read your book.
Well, that's great. Yeah, and that's so typical. I mean, it's like people just don't really know who he was, and I really feel like they should. I think he was one of the great exploratory leaders, but for the fact that when they encountered a massive gale in those open boats, the story would have turned out very differently. He did everything right, everything he could, until they reached open water. The DeLong Mountains are in far western Alaska. He never went there particularly, but he sailed past them, and I suppose they were just named in his honor, and rightly so. Rightly so. Yeah. What was the research that you were doing there?
We were looking for oil, actually.
Oh, oil. Okay.
we were mapping the mountains there to see if we could project from the mountains into the foothills and see where there might be potential oil there.
Yeah.
Just
Any
as
luck?
we had done. Well, we did earlier. We had Prudhoe Bay. Well, that was we did these surveys, 3 of them before the discovery of Prudhoe Bay.
Yeah.
And but that was on the other side, and I don't know that. I think there's a lot of talk about the Chukchi Sea and finding oil there.
Yeah.
I think there's a good chance, maybe, whether it can be economic, I don't know. And, they've drilled several wells up there at the moment, and of course now Shell is determined to spend billions.
Well, yeah, I mean that's a whole other story, but that is, of course, the crux of the matter in terms of the international interest in that part of the world right now.
Yeah.
It's oil and gas and shipping as well, and all these countries, not just Russia and the United States, but all the other Arctic countries are trying to extend the definitional the criteria of what constitutes the continental shelf or their national territory, their national domain. There's a lot happening in that whole realm. But anyway, other questions? Yeah, how you doing?
I'm doing well. The Shackleton experience seems to be fairly well known.
Yeah.
And this, I'm hearing this story for the very first time.
I know. Yeah.
Why do you think one has garnered so much more interest than the other?
That's a good question, and it's something I thought about a lot. It's like, well, how did this get buried? It's extremely well known in its time. Very consequential. People studied it. Shackleton studied this expedition. It was one of the early and one of the very important ones. Why? I'm not entirely sure. One of the reasons is I believe that the British are much better at sort of celebrating and mythologizing their sort of noble failures, let's call it. The Franklin expedition, one of the greatest failures of all time, is practically a religion in England. Shackleton, although he was able to get all his men back home, was a failure. They didn't reach their destination. And Scott, yeah. But the Americans in America, we like to win. We like results. We like to win. And I feel like there's an element of that at play here. Peary reached the North Pole, although that's somewhat disputed with Henson in 1909. That story sort of superseded the story of the Jeanette, I think, in a lot of ways. I think another reason is that we're a very visual culture, and unfortunately, all the photographs went down with the ship. And we have these paintings, but we don't really have photos. Shackleton, those amazing, if you remember, those amazing pictures, which kind of cemented that story in the public imagination in a way. And Nansen's voyages to the Arctic also, he had great photography, and I think that helped a lot. Also, it says something about DeLong. DeLong didn't pose for pictures. He didn't like to use the media. He was not a glory hound, and he didn't sit in a studio before he ventured to the Arctic to take lots of pictures. He thought all that was nonsense. So I think that's another reason. He didn't really understand media, and he in fact was quite contemptuous of it. So that's a factor. But it's also a very complicated story. Once those men get in those open boats in the water, in the open water of in the ocean, the story becomes very tangled, very complicated, and it took me a long time to sort out the narrative lines and sort of make it work as a story. So that's part of it as well. So those are some of my theories. If you got any ideas, let me know too. It's just amazing to me that so few people have heard of it. And everywhere I go on this book tour, I ask that question: who's heard of it? How many of you had heard of it? Prior to this book, very, very few. There have been books written that were generally written for a kind of military audience, or there is a polar buff. You mentioned having a genre of Arctic literature.
Yeah.
There are people who just can't get enough of these tales of woe, and those people certainly know the story of the Jeanette, but it's a pretty small subset. And I felt like it was important to kind of resurrect this story to a place where I think it belongs in a general sense, in a general readership. So that's what made me interested in the first place.
Jennifer, maybe one more?
When was the theory of the inland sea disproved? Was that before DeLong or after DeLong?
Well, of course, there's a lot of debate about that there may very well be an open polar sea in about 50 years. In the summertime, anyway. We're getting there. And so maybe he wasn't crazy or wrong. Maybe even Peterman wasn't wrong. Maybe he was just a little his timing was a little off. But no one else tried to go to the Arctic after Jeanette expedition to expressly to prove or disprove the open polar sea. That was the last one. In fact, it was one of the things this expedition did was finally threw that concept onto the dust, the dustbin, the what do you call it? The trash heap. Like when Nansen came along, he tried to reach the North Pole as well by sailing there, in effect. But he knew he wouldn't encounter water. Mm-hmm. That he was going to drift in the ice to try to reach the North Pole. And and the Jeanette expedition. I mean, it's like you can look at it as a failure. Or you can look at it as like the incremental improvements in our understanding that have to come with these expeditions. I mean, he discovered 3 islands. He went through over 1,000 miles of the Arctic that had never been seen before by man. He took all these measurements, but mainly he just proved the open polar sea. Let's have one last one.
Didn't the submarine Nautilus sail underwater all the way to the North Pole?
Yes. After Peary, and of course that's been contested. There were a number of other ways in which man reached. There was a flight. There were balloon attempts. Not too long ago, the U.S. The Russian Navy sent a submarine to the North Pole and planted a flag on the floor of the ocean at the actual North Pole. So it's it's a kind of a curious phenomenon. We still want to plant our flag and claim it and take the mystery out of all this and own it. It's strange, but as we know, there's really not a whole lot up there. It's just a constantly shifting carapace of ice. The idea of anyone actually owning it is ludicrous, and yet all these men, all these different expeditions, and this is just one of them, lost their lives or suffered horribly in order to try to find this thing and claim it and understand it. So it's something deeply embedded in our psyches as human beings to want to explore the unknown, and something about the very top of the world will continue to kind of exert this incredible fascination, I think, on human beings. So I'm going to sign some books, I hope, and meet some of you in person, but thanks so much for listening, and thanks for coming tonight.